have a couple of our alumni in the midst. And 3 of us faculty and 3 of our classes, and this really doesn't happen that often at Pepperdine, so thank you all for being here. I just want to share a little bit of background about our speaker, Elizabeth Edwards. So let me give you some of the short list of some of her awards that she has received. So first of all, thank you to Matt Ebling for being here, who oversees our alumni affairs. And but 2 of them actually were classmates and we went to Middleburg together. They both graduated in 1999. So thank you for coming back. I love having the alumni in the classroom. And a little bit about Elizabeth and some of the things that she has done. Y'all are in for a treat. She's going to be talking about ethics in public relations, but also strategic communication more broadly. So we do have students in each of these different areas. And so we really want to get a great conversation across the different majors. So you may have heard a little bit of some of the things that Elizabeth has done. She founded Volume PR Strategic Communication and PR firm 20 years ago, which is really awesome, right? Makes me feel old. When an alum comes back 20 years ago, she founded the company, as well as the Engagement Science Lab in 2018. She is part of, so really listen to this part. So she is part of the Frequency of Understanding movement, connecting human motivation, decision, behavioral, and neuroscience to leadership, marketing, and communication. So very innovative, really amazing, but she also has seen PR through the various stages. She works with Fortune 500 companies, global enterprises, with nonprofits, universities, government departments, and she's worked with brands such as Novartis, BMW, Transamerica, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Allstate, Charter, Arizona State University, and Shriners Hospital for Children. She formerly also had worked in Ogilvy PR, which many of you have heard of the different variations of the name of that, the Boeing Company's aerospace division, and she's been a keynote speaker and technology chair for Public Relations Society of America. So here's the short list of some of her awards that she's been recognized for. So she's a recipient of Visionary Top Woman in Communication, named by PR Daily in 2021, Outstanding Women in Business by the Denver Business Journal in 2020, Women of Excellence by the International Women Economic Forum in 2019, PR Professional of the Year by PR Daily in 2018. And prior to that, awards for the fastest growing business, as well as the 40 Under 40 award, named by the Denver Business Journal. And Pepperdine, absolutely. Pepperdine last year. Yeah. The 40 Under 40, yes, which you can read about on our website. Elizabeth is great. She's innovative and she's caring and passionate, and she's very much of a forward thinker. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Edwards today.
That's quite the introduction. How are you guys all doing today? You present? You ready for this? Let me see a show of hands. About how many of you are PR students? Okay, and then about how many are comms of other types? Did I get everybody there? Is there anybody else not represented in those 2 groups? Okay, so well, Wani did a spectacular job introducing, so I will skip through some of these portions here, make this fast. But as she mentioned, I began here at Pepperdine, graduated in '99, and when I left Pepperdine, I then went to work in internal and strategic comms at Boeing, and then in Ogilvy, and then before starting my own business. And what I'm here to talk to you guys about today, what really has me passionate around communication is, first of all, this whole thought, why do we communicate in the first place? Have you ever heard the saying, communication is key? I'm going to argue that it's not. Comprehension is what's key. You can communicate all day long, but if people don't understand you, and if what you're saying hits them differently than how you intended, triggers, demotivates, backfires, then did you do what you set out to do? Did the communication fail, or is it a failure in the receipt of the audience? So we believe that there are ways that we can refine and improve communication so that we are really focused on, did the other person understand me? Did I make sense to them? Are they motivated in considering what I'm saying and perhaps even changing based on what I've said? I also want to give you some of this kind of context for today. around communication and language. And that our language and our words are one of the oldest technologies that we have. And we want to really sink into what it means to consciously choose and design our words in order to address more complex challenges. Now, I know I work in PR and communication, so we're going to talk a lot about things related to marketing and mass comm. But every single thing I'm talking about today, I really want you all to hear me when I say this. You are going to be leaders of strategic thinking in your organizations. Those who have the comms background have an ability to contribute to the strategic conversation at an organization in an incredibly profound and complex way. And what I'm going to show you today, I will be so bold as to say, is the future of that strategic thinking and ideation process, and a way for you to really bring something very different into your organizations around how we solve problems. So a little framework for today, we're going to go through three things. We're going to start on the science of communication. What in the world does that mean? What is the science around engagement? Then around concepts of weaponization and manipulation. What's happening because of what we know about these sciences? And then lastly, we're going to get into some very specific language shifts and things that we propose making because of this. So for some background, we're pulling from a few different fields. Has anyone heard of communicology? That term, right? We're looking at what are the sciences specifically contribute to the practice of communication. So as Wani knows, when I was here, I wanted to major in psychological communication, and I was quite put out that that did not exist, and very frustrated that that wasn't a thing. And when I founded Volume, we focused instead on how do we pull in things from the human economics fields, from areas like communicology, which is looking at how we study in the science of how we interrelate with each other. How do we incorporate that into the work of communication? More specifically, what we pulled up here, I'll load all these for you, we study 4 specific different fields. We're looking at the behavioral sciences, the cognitive sciences, social sciences, and what we call evolutionary psychology. And when we study all these different fields, what do they teach us about how we communicate and how we make sense of things and how we understand, not just write this press release and get this news out there. If it backfires, if the audience says this is, I don't believe this, I don't do this, I don't like this, then we failed. So how do we dial that down more? A lot of you working in PR may also start working in what we call crisis communication, right? Where people come and knock on your door because something really bad has happened. And a lot of the time, we're working with companies who have done nothing wrong at all, but their reputation is being destroyed. So how do we manage and help in those types of situations? And not just based on historical best practices, but on what we know about the mind, all of these different fields. One of the things that is a simple and unifying element around all this is the fact that the sciences know that we have what are called cognitive biases. Anybody heard of biases? Has anybody heard of biases as a good thing? I see 2 hands, right? Anybody, don't you normally though hear, because normally what I hear is confirmation bias and how negative this is. These different biases that we have in our mind that contribute to us thinking incorrectly. Anybody ever heard of that? A lot of racism, sexism, ageism, all these things are because of these evil biases in your brain. And so organizations started bias training. We're going to come in, this is a big thing around our country, right? We're going to come in and we're going to teach you how your brain is making just incorrect choices. And you're just wrong because you're thinking in these certain ways. And it didn't really work very well. Turns out if you run around and shame everybody, they don't exactly feel motivated to change. And that training didn't give anyone answers really on what do you do differently or how do you think and communicate differently because of these known biases. What I'm showing you here, it's called the Cognitive Bias Codex. This was the last year they made a pretty picture out of it because there's now so many of them, they just can't squish them into a graphic. Here's what I want you to think about. This is the change. Your mind makes 35,000 decisions a day, processes about 70,000 thoughts a day, engages with about 50,000 external messages a day. If you did not have all of these in your mind, helping you make sense of your world,
we would be in a puddle in the corner, just, blah, 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 unable to function because we're so overwhelmed and overstimulated. These are a gift in our mind, the way that we make meaning and see and create understanding in our world. And the opportunity we have as communicators that we've never had before because they've never been mapped to this degree of awareness. The opportunity that we have is to see, what do we know about here? What do we learn about? What are different things that I then therefore want to include in my strategies? Or if I'm in charge of writing a press release to launch a new product, how am I going to do that? What clues are in here as to how I do that to be more effective? And there's a lot of clues in here. This is the science of communication. Let's teach you a few of them. Okay, we're going to look at just a few real quick. So let's say that you want to teach someone or have the world understand anything complex. And there's a lot of complex stuff, right? But especially understanding complex things. There's a bias called the von Restorff effect. Simple word, contrast. Okay? We like contrast. The brain can't help but compare. So when Whole Foods wanted to enter the conversation around the honeybees and issues around honeybees, to get the media's attention, to get people to listen in a different way, they put out a press release using contrast. Your produce choice with bees and your produce choice without bees. Real simple example of we know contrast works, so we can include contrast in our communication to deepen meaning and understanding, especially in situations of complex communication, complex topics. Has anyone heard the word hyper objects before? A lot of things like pandemics, world hunger, systemic injustice, civil discourse, these are topics that are what are known to be hyper objects. They're so big, can't really figure them out. And all the scientists and experts who work on hyper objects are on fringe silos around the edges. So there's economic scientists, and then there's medical scientists, and then there's climate change scientists, and all these different people coming in with their different perspectives. And it's all of us that just have to try to figure it out. And it's all of us that are the communicators, PR professionals, those holding the microphone and creating scripts for those holding the microphone that need to understand, and we do our jobs far better if we get the audience we're addressing is having to make sense of so many of these disconnected elements that it creates a lot more leaning back into our subconscious mind and on things like we're talking about today, of how we make sense and meaning. Let's look at another one. Humor effect is something we know also from the biases helps us remember things. Obviously, something that is not negative, for us to be motivated and have greater recall of something when it makes us laugh, and then therefore having greater brand attachment as well. So if I've got a crisis, I've got a communication problem, or there's anything, and I incorporate humor, you're more likely to remember. Is that evil to know that? Of course not. It's important that we understand these biases and look at the way that our brains were made and the way that we exist and see what is in that knowledge that serves and supports. So humor effect. Let's look at an example of how a brand used humor to manage a crisis. Now, some crises are real serious and some aren't. A lot of them aren't, and the social media makes it like they are. Anybody ever seen a crisis? It's not really that big of a deal. The social blows it way out of proportion. Well, this was happening in the UK when KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, didn't open one day. It's whatever the reason, they didn't open. And so all the people coming to work or all the people coming to get chicken were mad, and they're blowing up all over social media. Why isn't KFC open? And so upset. Now, how do you manage that crisis? Because they could come out, number one, main thing that we would do is we explain why. Start with why. Everybody heard this book? Love Simon Sinek, right? Explain the why. But what did they do instead? Because a lot of times if you explain the why in a crisis, it's like you're blaming other people, especially if it wasn't your fault. And in this case, it wasn't their fault. They changed to a new chicken supplier and they didn't show up. But I want to show you what they did, how they handled this crisis using humor effect. And it was praised as one of the most successful crisis communication techniques in the entire year. I know I've shared this one before, so I apologize when I'm putting up at Pepperdine, but this is the ad that they put out. And it just says, we're sorry, a chicken restaurant without chicken. It's not ideal, right? They rearranged the letters to make it a joke, to get everybody saying, this isn't that serious. And it was incredibly successful at de-escalating the crisis and getting everybody just back to work on what matters. Another thing, though, that we learned in this great big wheel that you saw, right? All those biases, all these scientific studies that we're learning about how your brain makes decisions. This one right here. You want to sit with this for a second. You don't realize it, but almost everything in our world right now is being messaged because of what's on the screen right here. Daniel Kahneman discovered prospect theory a number of years ago. Kahneman is an exceptional Nobel Prize winning scientist who has done phenomenal work. And here's the key thing, when we're studying the mind and learning how it works, there's not ethical attachment to that. We're just learning how it works and sharing that. It's then up to us in how we put it into practice or what we learn about it to determine, is that ethical? Is this something that serves in our tool chest? So prospect theory, what this finding is that you are more likely, significantly more likely, to respond to a negative, something that you stand to lose, than something you stand to gain. If I tell you, if you don't do X, Y, Z, you're going to lose your degree, you're more likely to do whatever that is. And I say, if you do X, Y, Z, then you're for sure going to have a really great degree. It's like, whatever, I care about what I stand to lose. Now, just because something's effective, wildly effective, does that mean that we use it? Because in this case, prospect theory, or what's known as pain gain messaging, has been used very heavily. Do we teach about pain gain messaging, kind of? That's been the norm in agencies. It's the norm in most organizations. There are countless companies out there right now training and certifying people on how to message and copyright and communicate for brands. And the number one thing that they do is teach you identify your audience's pain and your subsequent gain. Right? Seems kind of simple enough, doesn't it? But I want to show you something. Let's take a look at an ad that was created based on some of the things I shared with you today, like contrast effect, but that is also really heavily leaning into pain and gain. And then we're going to talk about what you're seeing here.
What does 10 years look like? Will you be quick enough for a game of tag with your grandchild? Strong enough to embrace every moment? Will you grow old with vitality? Or get old with disease? It's time to decide. I hope your associate will be with you shortly.
Did anybody like that? I describe that as absolutely sick, disgusting. What is happening here is what we call hyper manipulation in marketing. They know that contrast effect worked really well, so I'm going to contrast those two. I know that fear and pain work well, so I'm going to try and scare you and fear you and do all these things as well as I possibly can. And this is happening everywhere. This is a new norm in marketing. We are learning these great new things about the mind, so let's just use them as well as we can everywhere because the science says that's what's effective. Fear is effective. All right, so let's sit with this ethically for a moment. Fear is effective. Does that mean that we can use any and all forms of fear in communication and in marketing strategy and it be ethically aligned? I sure don't think so. Let's think about some ways that we know fear is not ethically aligned in life. I have two little boys. They are 10 and just turned 7. So let's say while I'm teaching them that you don't touch the stove, do I take my 6-year-old hand, just from 7-year-old hand, and put it on the fire and burn the heck out of his hand? Get it all totally ruined and melted so that he knows that's what happens if you touch fire and something hot so that he'll never do it again? Of course we don't. So why are we proceeding with fear and things that we now know in the sciences are only effective because they are activating what we know to be a known trauma, shame, or fear response in the audience. So this is where ethics becomes really, really very powerful, but also communication. Friends, we are at a moment in time, an intersection we've never been in before, where we have this incredibly sophisticated understanding of what's actually going on in the mind when we communicate with it. And we have an erosion of social cohesion worldwide because of a decline in civil discourse. And part of how that is happening is because of the weaponization of language, the weaponization of influence that is leading to what some describe as an incivility crisis. Remember, language being our oldest technology that we have, we can use it to save our world, or we can design it in incredibly inhumane ways that increase division and separation. If you've not seen The Social Dilemma, I highly recommend taking a picture of this, making sure that you check out this documentary. It's around how the same science that I'm talking to you about is being used to code the way social media delivers information. And after my talk today, I'm sure if you watch this, you'll be able to put the filter over all of it too, of saying, aha, I see how this applies to communication and the specific words being chosen. And do I want to be a puppet master of manipulation with my communication skills? Or do I want to know how to influence people civilly to change? So when we're thinking about how we use pain and gain and fear and things like this in messaging, it's about not exaggerating or applying it to absolutely everything that ever could be. Having pain gain as that core norm, think of communication as a chemical. Right? If we have pain gain as the first place from which we're going to start thinking about how we solve this problem, we have immediately rooted that base chemical in a negative, bad. And what we give is what we get. So we keep always thinking around that negative. We perpetuate more of that in our messaging. I have a link for you at the end of today to a communications audit and messaging and strategy document that we did for the state of Idaho's STEM education program, where you'll be able to see, if you would like, step by step, what was the message before that was based in pain gain and more of a weaponization approach versus more of a civil influence approach. So you can really see the specifics. But what I want you to understand, really key, we have such siloed, tiny views of all of these scientific studies. And because of that, people pick them up one at a time and use them like a weapon. And that's what's happening when it comes to things like fear and pain. But they play a role in the bigger symphony of strategies. And that's the work that our agency does, and what I'm trying to give you a taste of today. When you understand more of all the biases in there and how they all work together, we can actually be even more effective than picking up some of the blunt instruments like pain and gain and beating people over the head with just something that's in a negative. All right, so we've talked a bit about communication, the science, and some of that weaponization. Now I want to look at this in practice. Okay, we're in Malibu, we're at a beach, right? Tell me, please, what are some of the signs or things that you see in Malibu around keeping the beach clean, or that are meant to help communicate that type of concept of keeping the beach clean?
There's trash cans at like every public beach. I know like Ralph's Beach, a lot of Pepperdine students go to, and the entrance of the beach has like 4 garbage cans with like little flyers on them.
Yeah.
Saying, like trash, like keep the beach clean.
Yeah, that's when I was here. It was really neon, brightly painted trash cans, so it was really obvious of where they were. Is there anything else that they're doing? Any other signage? Yeah. Yes, there's that punitive, here's what you're gonna get in trouble with if you don't do that. Is there someone else? Yeah, so we've got things that inform, make possible, right? Here's the trash can, and then we're gonna penalize, this is all the bad things that are gonna happen to you if you don't. Okay, so let's say the state of California hired you to get the beaches clean. You're communication professionals, PR professionals, this is the type of work you could get hired to do. It's your job to change behavior along the coastline of all of California to get people to clean up when they go to the beach. What you gonna do, guys? Those trash cans ever changed your behavior? Did the signs around, don't do this or you're gonna get fined or whatever, does that change your behavior hugely? Or maybe just influence you a little bit? When we're thinking from a base calm chemical of pain, negative, paternalism, what we come up with are things like signs. Let me just tell you, you just don't know. You just don't know, you poor soul. Let me just explain to you, we don't do that here. We take care of the beaches here. And guess what? They already know. And it's actually quite rude, condescending, paternalism to sit there and just be like, hey guys, it's about cleaning up. Or you can go that route too of just, hey guys, here's the fine if you don't do it. Does that make any of you want to clean the beach more? So you've been hired by the state of California. What are you going to do? What do we really do? And I think part of the challenge is we don't really realize when we are communication professionals, we are agents of change at the core of what we do. Communication is change. It's getting you to change from knowing what I'm talking about to not knowing what I'm talking about to knowing it, from not caring to caring, from not taking action to taking action. So what I'm going to show you today, here in a moment, of how we start to use the science in what we call a civil influence capacity. I want to give you an example of civil influence in cleaning up the beach. This is a fish named Gobi. He's a very large wire mesh art installation. He has a little sign on the front that says, my name's Gobi. I'm hungry. I eat plastic. Please feed me. And he's on a beach in Indonesia. And so the people in the community, when they're going to go to the beach at night, what has happened is there's nobody saying, you bum, quit bringing your junk. How dare you? You inconsiderate louse. Here's the fee I'm going to charge you because you aren't taking care of the beach. No. There's Gobi. And what's happened is the people in the community have changed their behavior so much, they like to feed Gobi. Feeding Gobi is fun. So more people take walks on the beach and pick up whatever trash they do see so that they can go feed Gobi with it. Now, again, you were just hired to change behavior in the state of California around how we behave at beaches. Does this make you want to litter a little less on that beach? Or maybe pick up what you see and go feed Gobi? So if we think just from that pain gain, I have to talk to my audience about what's wrong and how we solve it. See the rut that gets us in? Of thinking from a perspective that leads us to say, I need to give them more information. I just need to tell them. They just don't know. I need to lecture and list and legalize. Let's look at another example. Let's say you have a critical blood shortage in your community and you've been hired to increase blood supply, get people to go donate blood. How do we do that? There's a lot of ways. Let's look at all these. Alliteration, giving equals living. We know that if you make things rhyme, it's called the Pied Piper effect. People are far more likely to remember it and follow it. So make things rhyme as much as you can. But giving equals living. Anybody gonna run out and donate blood tomorrow? Of course not, right? I give this presentation often and I look at this and say, tell me truthfully, is anyone in this room gonna go donate blood tomorrow because of anything you see on this sign? No, not one of us. So again, if you're a communication professional and it's your responsibility to influence this behavior, how do you do that? Well, if you're using more of the symphony of strategies from the sciences and considering your audience your ally, you might do what they did in Sweden, where blood donors get a text message every time their blood. Ooh, you feel that? How many of you would go donate blood tomorrow if you knew that you were going to be told how that blood was used? Yeah, exactly. One is thinking, how do I solve this problem where my audience just doesn't know what to do? They need to be told, I'm gonna wag that finger, right? Versus how do I involve them? How do I create a sense of allyship? So we're gonna look at some new terms, civil communication and civil discourse. Civil communication being, how do I communicate on the basis of respect, responsibility, and restraint? Restraint. Meaning I know some things that I can use from the sciences that may juice this really good, but it's not ethical for me to do that. I'm going to restrain myself and communicate this in the most respectful and responsible way. Not hyper-focused on a short-term gain, because the things I'm talking to you about that are the negatives, those are things known to get us really quick short-term gains in communication, but not long-term necessarily. Where I have a relationship with this business, this brand, this individual, this university, so I stay here forever, as opposed to just what you could squeeze out of me in the 3 months before I unsubscribed to your horrible communication tactics. And then civil discourse. Can we have an impact on civil discourse as communication professionals? Or maybe I should ask that of, if we don't redefine civil discourse, who in the world will, if not us? Who in the world is going to model a healthier language pattern and start to identify what these language norms are that are contributing to unrest, if not us? So some other terms, we now teach what we call allyship communication. That's what I'm giving you a taste of here today. How do I build connection based on trust, consistency, accountability? And we do that, you practice all of this by first focusing on what we call attunement to audience agency. Now, we have all heard, we've got to keep things really simple, and we talk down to people like they're in a 3rd grade level. And this is true in communication. We need to keep it simple. But where I think we've gotten a little bit off the rails, just ever so slightly, but it makes all the difference, is that we took this whole keep it simple, talk to them like they're in the 3rd grade, to I'm also going to treat them like they're in the 3rd grade. I'm going to treat them like they're not that smart. And that's why we get so much paternalism and legalism and lecturing in communication, as opposed to things that create collaboration and involvement and success. These are not supposed to be there. We already saw this. Okay, so let's talk about all of this is something that is what we call generationally entrained, behaviorally entrained. A lot of the communication norms, we didn't take communication in elementary school. We learned this from our parents, who learned it from their parents, who learned it from their parents. And there's so many things that we have learned that we now know, because of how we study the science, are actually only effective because it's like me putting my kid's hand in the fire to teach them that fire is hot. They're only effective because they are triggering in you a trauma, shame, and fear response. And I know that we all know that that is not right to do. And so what do we do to stop these from being such normed patterns? So the first thing we have to do is be aware of them. Start to define them as they are. We can start with pain and gain and fear. And that in fear, oh, that's what I skipped over. Sorry, guys, that there are 2 forms of fear in the world, is what I was sharing here. There's the kind that is inherent and necessary in order to explain and accurately navigate understanding. At the end of the month, I am teaching people in charge of rail safety how to communicate at a state level to decrease the amount of train incidences and deaths from people getting hit by a train. I live in Colorado. Did you guys hear what happened in Colorado last week? A police officer pulled a woman over, put her in his cop car while it was sitting on train tracks, and left her in the back. And it got hit by a train. We know what to do. Your job as communication professionals isn't primarily to communicate things that people already know. It's how do you communicate it in a way so that they hear it and they change. So there's this form that is necessary in order to navigate understanding. And then there is when we heighten it and exploit it and use it everywhere as this base chemical that really, really interrupts us being able to identify when something really is a pain or a problem. How do I know when to flag that? If everything's base chemical is fear and negativity. So there's a few other things that we've learned. I want to give you guys just a couple more tastes of some other language shifts. So we talked about pain, gain, and that norm. Has anyone heard of the term thought terminating cliches, or thin versus thick evaluative language? This is really powerful stuff for you to be learning at this stage in your careers. We have thin language and we have thick language. I'm going to have some tables up here in a second, and I believe we're giving you all a copy of this presentation too, so you can have this for your notes. But just like thin and thick, as the words may imply, is thin is something that is not very deep, not very considerate, where thick would be big and complex. And so cliches, like it is what it is. We now know from more of the research being done that things like like cliches are actually what is known as a form of loaded language that shuts down argument. It's not just it is what it is. It's not just a little flippant, random thing that we say. If Wani and I are having a really in-depth conversation and she just says, it is what it is, she just told me to shut up. She didn't use those words, she's far more polite, but that is what she just did to my subconscious. She's saying, I'm done with this conversation. We've talked about it enough, it is what it is. You need to accept that and move on. I know she's not feeling that inside. Is that really what she's meaning to say? A lot of our uses of cliches, we aren't even realizing what we're doing, but these are what the scientists call semantic stop signs. Your non-conscious brain, subconscious makes 95 to 99% of your decisions. Remember, it's the one running that whole show, so you're not blubbering in the corner. And when I march in with a cliche, it is a known mind control technique to brainwash people in cults that I am using with you to get you to don't think any deeper. We've gone as far as we're going to go. There are so many uses of these in business, in teams, in corporate communication, in marketing and language. And I want you to know what this really is, though. Just as we're not putting our kids' hands in the fire, we aren't going to manage organizational communication, teamwork communication, the way that we strategize as a team. How much more effective might we be if we're leading a brainstorming strategy or any kind of thinking around language, and everyone in the room knows that we don't use cliches this way or knows what's happening? And we've created awareness around it so that when they do come out of our mouth, we can pause and say, wait a sec, that's not what I meant to say. I want to make a different choice right now. What do I want to say instead? And then where does the conversation go? I love the strategy part of our job. That's my absolute favorite. It's big thinking and problem solving and how communication can really affect change. And since we have started teaching our clients the things that we do not do anymore, and there's a few more I'll show you, but things such as hyper-focus on fear and pain, the use of thought-terminating cliches. It's so amazing what happens in just that space of brainstorm. Try it in your team projects, right? When your senior projects, whatever it is that you're doing, when someone uses a cliche, say, hey, what that's actually doing in our subconscious mind is telling us we can't think about this anymore. If we want to keep getting deeper into this topic and really figure this out, what would we say instead? Teamwork it together. No one has done this yet. We are the first people raising this flag of awareness and saying this is what we need to do differently. This is called civil social behavior change communication. It's one of kind of the industry frames around all of this. And what we are giving you an example of, I'm going to now show some tables to summarize some of the top ways that we make this shift to civilly influence. We call it civil influence because civil communication, yes, but the way that we are all going to be applying is to influence audiences, to influence organizations and people at scale. So how do we do that? What does it look like if it's manipulation versus if it's really on a collaboration and an education side of things? So here's a few charts. Thin versus thick. I showed you thought terminating cliches. They are an example of a thin style of language that we would want to replace instead with more thick, considerative language. So thin, things that are about what's good, what's wrong, permissible, things that shorten conversation. Like Matt, if I was here to say, anybody says, hey, do you know Matt? And I'm like, oh yeah, I know Matt, he's so nice. That's really thin, right? If I say, oh, do I know Matt? Matt's so creative and has such energy and life. I mean, he was Tigger at Disneyland and it still is there in him today, right? There's thick. See the difference? The main difference in me though is that I just have to pause for about 2 seconds in my head. And then the thick one comes. I think we're on the rails of thin language being so normed, but it's just what comes out. We don't even realize what we're doing. The first step is awareness. Realizing that's actually what I'm doing. I'm keeping things in this more shallow way. How do I, in my organization, in my teams, in my universities, get us into this more thick, evaluative, intentional conversation. This one is really powerful too. Let's look at this a little more. How do I shift from what we call manipulation marketing to allyship engagement, allyship communication? Just conceptually, it's a move from more of a, I must conquer, I must win, I must get the mass amount of conversion, to I am going to connect with my audience. And I will still win and get the mass amount of conversion, but it's through connection and collaboration rather than conquering. The bottom here are a few other examples. We only have so much time, and this is a lot of information to go through, so I'm trying to condense. But we talked about fear as one of those things being incorrectly used. Let me give you two others: urgency and scarcity. We know from all those biases. If I make you feel like there's a deadline on something and I attach rush and urgency to it, you're more likely to move fast. So think about if you've been on any websites where you see those little pop-ups at the bottom that say, Sarah just downloaded this and Heather just bought this and there's only 3 left of this, and ways that communication and technology are being coded to manufacture scarcity and urgency when it doesn't otherwise exist. And that's incredibly uncivilized practice, because what that does then is make it so that we do not respond to things that are truly urgent. There's no way to be able to tell the difference between all of those. So a few more examples here: not manufacturing rush, not manufacturing scarcity, not manufacturing and exploiting fear. Some of the key shifts between manipulation versus allyship. So I can now leave you. I have a few minutes for questions, but I want you to take down this link if you would like to see a specific, I think it's about 60 some pages, because it was done for a government client. It is public and on the internet, so you can access that. But it explains and shows you how we change the audience identification, even strategically for an organization that is so in the pain gain being the way that I think about things, that every message and every strategy for the entire state of Idaho changed around this shift. They used to say everything is about, if you're going to get your kid involved in STEM education, it's all about the fact that there's not enough people in the state of Idaho to fulfill the jobs that we need in 20 years. That's their pain and gain message. And I know most of you aren't parents yet, but for the parents in the room, I don't think about putting my kid in the STEM program because I'm worried about what the state's going to have as their problem in 20 some years. Really great example for you guys to just see it in actual practical form in this download of what that looks like. So with that, I think we have just about 5-ish minutes or so if there's any questions.
So much great stuff, right? Where do we start? So,
Yeah, that's a lot.
what are your questions?
There a point in career where you in the real world face this sort of inhumane form of marketing? And if we do, what specific things haven't you done in the past or tips to help us sort of deal with that?
Yeah, so the questions, have I had to deal with anything kind of inhumane and what tips do I have?
Example of a tip.
Exactly. So an example would be clients coming to us that are kind of excited about some of these new forms of communication, like FOMO.com. FOMO.com is social proof pop-up. So social proof is another thing in that big bias wheel that we look to the outside society to tell us how to behave. What is my peer group doing? Whatever they're doing, that must be what I need to do then to be safe and to survive. And so a big part of what we're doing right now is when companies are coming to us saying, we see this little widget or this little thing that hyper stimulates any of the elements here, we are letting them know why it's effective and how it will sabotage long-term success. That these are things that may work momentarily, but they're not about creating a long-term relationship with the client, which is your ultimate success metric. And so it's not a simple plug and play kind of answer, but you are the strategist that is respected exponentially more when you say, no, we don't do that, because you might see a blip in increase in sales for 3 months, but then you're going to see your subscribers drop. You're going to have far more chargebacks. You're going to have all these other things that are the negatives that happen when you're picking tools or techniques that only work because they're the equivalent of putting my kid's hand on fire. Yes.
And the two examples you used about the fish in Indonesia and the Swedish texts, donating blood, both of those have like a consumer benefit of like receiving, whether it's like joy from kind of interacting with the fish or just a feeling of like, I don't know, courage or like hope when you text from the Swedish people. So do you think that you need something like that in order for your messages to be content where you're like the consumer gets some benefit, whether it's like or just
Yeah, the so what, the what's in it for me with them, or, to start with why, and Simon Sinek too. Getting it back to what benefits someone is key, but I think it's about looking at it from that allyship lens of, if I'm communicating to this audience and they're the same as me, they're equal to me, how would I want to be engaged and communicated with, and what would make me want to participate in this? We come up with different solutions and approaches there. And they are not always with a carrot at the end. There's not always some dangle of big gain, especially I can think of some of the crisis things that we've managed where it was just flat out communication and understanding and creating awareness, like the humor example. There's no gain for the audience other than a gain in understanding in a simplified way. So let me say that a different way. You can communicate with 15,000 words to make a point. You can find that really condensed, simple way like KFC did. That's the biggest responsibility that you have, isn't what's the carrot, but what's the most concise way to communicate so that they reach a point of understanding quickly, and therefore their behavior changes because they have understanding. KFC, it's all right, there was chicken trucks, went to the wrong place, it's not that big of a deal. I'm gonna calm myself down, even though I haven't gained anything other than the information. Great question.
Well, this is more like a personal thing for you. What was maybe your favorite thing or like most impactful thing that you've done in your line of work, and why did it make you feel that way?
Love that question. So the most impactful thing in my line of work, and how has it made me feel?
Yeah, or like favorite.
Well, I know this isn't probably the answer you want, but it's the creating of this work as a whole. It is the realization of what's happening and why certain things are so effective. And right now in our world, we're at a place where, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of people running around with that as their new shiny object. And so even more waves of uncivil communication being normed. And it feels profoundly important to have put together that these things are effective only because they are rooted in a trauma response in the audience and therefore increasing backfire. We didn't even talk about backfires, it's whole own class of the 6 different types of backfire that we trigger and how not to trigger those different forms. But it is the kind of putting all of this together and then being able to teach companies how to shift their communication as a whole so that we change behavior more. So like at the end of the month, teaching trained professionals how to change behavior. Everybody who talks to the trained professionals, it's about make a bigger sign. It's about say the words more aggressively. They just don't know. What cop doesn't know not to park on train tracks? They know, right? So I am very proud and excited that we have this new perspective as a way of thinking about things to then train those communication professionals. How do you make sense to people and it saves lives? And a lot of what we're doing, ultimately, the end result is saving lives in many different ways.
Yeah, so this is just out of curiosity. So depending on your target audience, like you said, saving lives. Good type of idea thinking to work in the case that you want the best out of people in gym.
This summer, I was speaking at the International Association of Business Communicators Conference in New York. I know about, thanks. I'm teaching about IADC. And I've been speaking at these conferences about motivation, human behavior, all that for some time. So I presented on this in a breakout room. And the next day, the keynote speaker was a guy from Australia talking about this on the keynote stage. And so about 40% of the room had been in my session and had heard all about this. And then they went and they asked him the same thing. People asked him the same, because he wasn't talking about it this way. It was just like, look, there's this lever you can move around in someone's head and it'll make them dance. Isn't that great? Like, let's wiggle the lever. And And his answer was, I'll tell you what he said, and then what that made me think. And he asked the room, did any of you drive here today? And it was Manhattan, so he wasn't reading the room very well, because nobody really did. But the point being, he said, did you stay between the white lines? Did you stop at the light? It's like, oh, you conformist, you. It's good for us to have these rules, and people need to know the lanes to stay in between, and that's just what it is. How does that make you feel? It didn't make me feel too great to hear, just be paternalist, do that. People need to be told what to do because they're too stupid otherwise. So no, I'm gonna say, I don't think that there is. I think that when we put ourselves in that, I am such an authority, that I am the Godhead to tell you everything, that there are audiences we are losing right away just because we take that kind of stance. And when you're communicating on behalf of governments and world leaders and things like that, as we do, think about that. I mean, there's huge ripple effect of that whole energy of, I'm just the best and it's the law and this is what it is. And so I'm going to put a fine against it, or I'm just going to tell you these are the lines and stay between them because I said so. Because I said so. It's another thought terminating cliche. We don't say it with my kids anymore once I realized what we're doing, right? We're saying, stop asking me. I just said it and you don't need to ask anymore. So every situation is nuanced. Drop that in of there are times when it's right to ratchet the fear up to the highest level. Part of what I'm talking to the train people about is that you want to save lives. People aren't scared enough of trains. People think that they see them coming and hear them coming and that they have plenty of time, and they don't. And it is uncivilized, in my opinion, to not scare them properly about that, to not create the right level of fear. And what's wrong, it's like we're so feared about everything, from even STEM education in the state of Idaho to, to trains, that it's a hyper object, right? It's like fear is now the hyper object, and I don't pay attention to any of it, and it's all blurred. So I would want to know what I want to always look at the nuance of the situation, but for the most part. Good question.
I have a question. So in your lengthy experience, have you ever had a client that asked you to do something unethical? And if so, how do you feel about that situation?
Yes, we have had clients ask us to do unethical things and we have said no. And we have told them what is going on as to why that is unethical. And often they do not even realize that that's what's happening. No one's wanting to do something dirty and do people dirty. They just want to be successful. And so they are normed in thinking, if I'm going to be successful, it's because I have to do it this way. And what we're showing them is actually there's a far more sophisticated way for you to be successful. And you may not electrocute as many results out of the audience in 3 months, but in 6 months, 12 months, your organization will be far healthier. And I cannot think of a single company that I go into where I don't stand out like a shining star when I say things like that, as opposed to the Yahoo who's like, I'm going to get you really good and I'm going to get those numbers up so huge next month. You know what? If the client wants that, then that's not the client I want. There's so many businesses, people, universities changing our world for the better. There's enough for us to focus on and helping those, and let these other people spin in their manipulative turmoil to destroy themselves. We're not going to participate.
Well, I think that's the right note to end on, right? So your expertise, but also to ask those moral questions, and I think teaching the people who are creating messages, right? So you're emulating what you're asking them to do. So if you haven't already, all the students, there's like a couple cards, so I want you just to sign in with your class. And then we just have little Pepperdine Comm Division swag. Did you need more orange and blue?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.